Hey everyone, welcome back. Welcome to episode 3 of the series of YouTube videos that support Chief Petty Officer's Guide. Today we're going to talk about Chapter 2, the fundamentals of CPO power and influence. So this is where the guide really gets into a concept that I think many of us have heard of, perhaps. When I'm out engaging audiences, I often ask about who knows about power bases, who's heard of them. Most people have heard of them. I won't say most. Some people have heard of them. But their knowledge of it is very minimal and the depth is not there. So I start this part of it out and I've got the model laid out, but with a simple question of what is leadership, right? And I typically will ask the audiences I engage with to give me one word, what is leadership to them? And I'll hear a variety of phrases. I'll hear everything from character to people to fairness, leading from the front, all these kind of phrases they've heard or these kind of models they've got in their head. And none of those are wrong, but they don't really fully capture the full extent of how of what leadership is. And ultimately that one word is influence. When I do go to the senior enlisted academies, they do tie leadership into influence. So when you think about leadership, I want you to start thinking of it differently. When you hear the word leader, leadership, leading, I want you to replace that word with influence. So influence, influencer, or influencing. And I think you'll see quickly it helps reframe how you think about leadership and the interactions it involves. So chapter 2 came about really is the unique approach of the book, I think, that differed from the previous edition. So I had read extensively a bunch of different leadership books, and I came across a management book for an upper class, for a master's degree class, and it introduced me back to this concept of power bases and influence tactics. And when I thought about it and read about it through this chapter and how it was framed out, I'm a visual learner, so I was able to kind of put this concept and what I had read about into kind of a visual model that I really had never seen before. And it really helped bring together all the different aspects of leadership. So I'm going to briefly touch on it today. We'll talk about this more in further videos. But if you look on page 26 of your Chief Petty Officer's Guide, you'll see the model that I'm talking about. I've got it up here briefly on the screen. It probably looks reversed to you now, but I'm going to talk through what that is. Okay, so really it's a relationship model. Some of it echoes the communication model that you've got, but when I frame it, I walk through the chapters, or in the chapter I'll walk through this. I'm going to introduce you to the different aspects of this model and how it comes together briefly. And then, like I said, as you go through each chapter, it's going to go through different power bases or communication venues a little more in depth. Okay, so for the purpose of chapter 2, let's just talk about this power and influence model. I call it the CPO power and influence model, but it could apply to anything. If you're a civilian, all this stuff works. It's fundamental knowledge. And to some of you, it may be fundamental and you may know it, but it's good from time to time to go back and go, okay, let me gauge the strength of my power bases. How have they changed? What's changed? How well am I using influence and influence tactics? Am I, finding myself relying on a few and not using the full range of them? So once again, the guide is supposed to be a tool of self-reflection. So I introduce you to this concept of a power and influence model, and then you go back using the questions at the end of the chapter and evaluate where you may be weak, where you're strong, where you can improve, and hopefully that'll make you a better leader as you go out and practice these tactics, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So the first thing I want you to understand, right, there's a relationship model. Some of the vernacular is you are the agent of influence, and you're trying to influence some targets, okay? And through that influence, you're trying to achieve outcomes. So I always tell you to start to the right of the model. So if you're on page 26, go all the way to the right, and it's going to talk about outcomes, right? It's going to talk about warfighting readiness for the terms of naval audiences. But also as you shape, those things you're after, right? So I tell a Chief Petty Officer, what you're really after is the material, operational, and personal warfighting readiness of that division or that unit of the command you own. As a departmental LCPO, this model translates up. So as an LCPO for a department, now you're worried about departmental readiness, operational, material, and personnel. And in many cases, that starts to bring you outside of your rating area, and you've got to understand about other ratings and other aspects of your department that you may not know. And then finally, as a mass chief, you take that up. Now you're getting into the command level, or what General Mattis would refer to as executive and strategic levels of leadership. and who your target's there and what you're thinking about. They change as you move up, right? Your new target is not necessarily the deck plate sailor. It's now your commanding officer, your admiral, the staff, fellow command master chiefs, a force, a fleet master chief, what have you. So understanding your target and the objectives is important as you go through this. As you go through and you're influencing through this process, you're also shaping an attitude though too. So it's not just achieving the responsibilities that you have the authority to achieve. It's also shaping attitudes, right? And there's three general ones I'll introduce you to, right? There's commitment to the organization. There's compliance, just getting people to come there and do what you need them to do, and that's okay. Those two are good. The third one is resistance, right? And I tell people it's not necessarily that they're resistant to you, but for some reason they're resistance to receiving influence towards the objectives you're out to obtain, okay? So when you start right, what are your responsibilities? What do you know? What are you after? And then what are the attitudes that currently exist in your organization, and what are the attitudes you want to shape going forward, okay? So then we take it all the way back to the left and we start talking about you, okay? Number one, you have some values, beliefs, and objectives you're after that are shaping how you're going to select and wield influence going forward. But you're really vested with these things that we're going to talk about called power bases. Okay? In 1959, John R.P. French and Bertram Raven came up with this concept. They initially had 5 power bases. They had positional power, expert power, reward power, coercive power, and personal power, referent power. And then a few years later, they split out expert into expert power and information power. Since then, there's been additional studies have gone on, and there's 2 additional bases that I added to it called connection power. And we talk about that, and your ability to wield influence through the relationships and connections and networks you've developed, and then also ecological power as well. We're not going to go through every power base in depth right now as I normally would during the seminar I give for this, but I will do on future videos. We'll cover down on each one of those and explain, we can talk specifically about position power like we're going to in the next chapter, because you can misuse your position power, right? And you can erode it, and it can get you in a bad place. So I just wanted to let you know I'm going to introduce you into those power bases. I give a little introduction in the book and what they are, what each one is, and then we'll build on them in future editions of this, okay? So as you can see, you got your power bases, but if you consider that the potential energy you've got to influence things, then you've got to convert that potential energy into kinetic energy, right, and make things happen. So we do that through a thing called influence tactics. And you've probably been using all these at some point in your career. You probably just don't know what they've been called, theoretically, but I think it's important for you to understand what they are. So we talk about these, everything from rational persuasion, inspirational appeals, ingratiation, exchange, apprising appeals, and then all the way down to legitimizing tactics and pressure tactics. And once again, the book introduces you briefly to what those are, but that you've got available, right? So between your power bases and your influence tactics, this is your tool bag that you've got for wielding influence, okay? The next area we're going to go to is once you understand your influence tactics, you've got power bases that are built up to support each one. For example, rational persuasion. If I'm going to use rational persuasion or trying to influence people using facts and logic, I've got to have some expert power, right? So there's some linkage there. I may use my information power base to strengthen that as well. So each influence tactic has power bases that strengthen it and underlie it. So that's one of the things I'll tell you to self-assess is, hey, maybe you're not good at using a legitimizing tactic because you don't have the positional authority to leverage that influence attempt. But to wield this, you've got to select a channel of communication, right? So there are several things you can do, everything from your personal presence, right? Just being there in many cases just can get people to do things. But you got oral communication skills and written communication skills that you're going to use. And these days, written communication, oral communication goes just like I'm doing now into the social media sphere as well. So those are tools of influence and communication. So we talk a little bit briefly about those. When the Petty Officer Guide comes out next spring, that will go much more into depth in communication and the fundamentals of communication. I touch on it here in the Chief Petty Officer's Guide because I had to acknowledge that at some point Chief Petty Officers have some fundamental, if not advanced, communication skills. But you've got to continue to develop those and build those as you progress. And the scope of your channels of communication is going to change, right? So as a Fleet Master Chief, I had a huge scope to communicate to, right? So I had to use all those channels of communication, but then I had geographical distance that I had to contend with. You're not going to be able to get in front of every person all the time you're trying to influence. So you've got to use these other channels of communication and start to understand and be adept at connecting with audiences through a variety of methods. So some people just aren't good at oral communication. They're not comfortable speaking to large groups. It's not where they thrive, but that stuff can be learned and practiced. And I give some tips and advice on how to get better at that. And then finally, we got to discuss, as we'll see in your guide, the barriers to your influence. So you can try to influence all day you want. Yes, absolutely. In the military, you've got positional power. You've got authorities as a chief petty officer or an officer, and you can get things done just by the nature of your position. But if you really want to generate buy-in and move your people from compliance or resistance up to commitment and develop esprit de corps and good morale in your unit, this is when you have to be able to use your expert power and your personal power, your competence and your character that they're always referred to build your credibility, which gains you trust. And then with trust, you'll get the buy-in and be able to elevate your teams to higher level. But there are barriers to that. Right, I mentioned earlier, there's your personal biases, your personal beliefs that may be a part of the issue. There's receptivity of your audience. So this is kind of when you look at your target audience, usually at the individual level, but it can be at the group level as well. That Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? If people are focused on lower level needs, it's going to be hard to elevate them to higher levels, or they may be misfocused from the job at hand because they're focused on personal security or other things as well. So we discussed that too. Some of the barriers are physical, right? Just the noise, the things you're used to communicating. But your target audience has values and beliefs, right? There's differences in generations, how we communicate, what they value, and how you approach them. That can be a barrier as well. So we talk a little bit about the barriers to influence and the things that can frustrate you as a leader. And then finally, I go into the chapter, and it's interspersed throughout it, but we're going to talk about things like, hey, there's a context to this model, right? So yes, there's rational persuasion, right? I can explain why and use logic to make you understand why we're doing what we're doing. But there's times in a place when I can't explain why, right? When we're in an emergency situation or a crisis, I just need to go into training. And if I give orders, if I give direction, you just got to be compliant and follow it. I don't have time to explain it. So you may find yourself shifting down to more legitimizing or pressure-based tactics in emergency situations, and that's okay. So as a leader, you've got to be able to use all these influence tactics and apply them as the context dictates. You can find, though, if you go to pressure tactics all the time when you don't need to, you're going to alienate your audience, and you can actually drive people from compliance and commitment down to resistance. And that's how this plays out. Those are a few things we're going to talk about, and then we're going to introduce you to things like, hey, there's vectors of influence. So who you are influencing will change, right? So as a chief petty officer, we talk to you about leading up, down, and across. So leading down is the one you're probably the most familiar with, right? It's leading your sailors and the people that work for you towards the accomplishment of your individual and organizational goals. Leading up would be your influence on your boss or the wardroom in many cases. And then leading across is going to be your influence on your peers and your relationships within the chief's mess. And like I said, we're going to go into different chapters that are going to cover down each one of those. So that's chapter 2 in an overview. The next one we're going to talk about in the next episode is going to be using your positional power and going more into depth than that. So until next time, make sure you subscribe and hit that subscribe button, like this channel, and then share it as you go through. See you next time.